Hey there, Bijan. How are you?
Hey, doing well. How are you?
Good.
Um, just gonna start letting people in 1 second. Give me 1 second.
Okay.
Um, just gonna,
Do you have a good start to
yeah.
the weekend?
It was a great weekend. Yeah, I mean, I had a bit of a travel, but most of the travel is over.
Hmm.
I'm back, so that makes it easier. Let me just like all the tricky parts. Okay, okay, okay. Start letting people in. Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's session. Um, okay, so give me a few minutes as I'm waiting for more people into the session. I'm also going to go live on LinkedIn as well. So here we go live on LinkedIn. Okay, great. Okay, perfect. Um, okay, cool. So hi everybody, just like letting people in. Give me a couple minutes um, before we get started. I can see people are also starting to join on LinkedIn as well, which is great. All right. All right. More people are joining. This is great. Very excited about today's session. Looking forward to it. I think responsible AI has become a pretty hot topic, especially with what's going on uh, Google recently with their product. I think this is going to be a very good presentation. I think you guys will all find it beneficial. Thank you so much, Shilan. I'm glad to hear that you find it helpful. So, in the interest of time, we're going to get started and I'm going to continue letting people into the room. But first of all, I want to kind of make a couple quick announcements. First thing first, very excited to say that we're continuing to receive a lot of good applications from people for the next cohort. Just a quick reminder that for the next cohort, we're going to have three different tracks. Basically, one is going to be on Tuesday evenings, one is going to be on Thursday mornings, and one on Saturday morning. So if you're on evening or morning, you'll find a time to take advantage of our learning material. I think it's going to be the best cohort we've ever had. So you'll find it very helpful. One of the things that we really like about this cohort is that there's going to be a lot of focus on actually building something through the PRD. We're doing that in the current cohort, and a lot of people have reached out to us that this is a really good experience. It's a painful experience, but you'll find a lot of value in it. So I highly recommend people that are exploring to become an AI product manager to consider our learning program. I think it's going to be very valuable. If there's time, we'll have somebody from the current cohort maybe to share their experience with us so that people can find benefit. And just a gentle reminder that there's always a 7-day refund guarantee. So in case you sign up and you decide this is not the right fit, you can always get a request, get a full refund. Also next week, we're going to have somebody to come in and talk to us about bias in AI, which is also very important from a product perspective. And finally, for those of you that are not on Zoom, if you're interested in joining on Zoom instead of being on LinkedIn, you can just like kind of use our page here. I'm going to share the link here on the LinkedIn channel. You can just like use it, enter your email address there, and what this will do is it'll allow you to receive a calendar invite for all the upcoming events. So with that said, let's jump right in. Very, very excited to introduce a guest today, James, who has worked with Meta on AI product management, is with us. He's an experienced PM. He's going to tell us a lot about his experience and some of his perspectives on responsible AI from a product manager perspective. Very excited for it. First of all, thank you so much, James, for coming in. And we're very honored to have you. We have a lot of people also attending our session from LinkedIn, and we look forward to a very productive session with you. With that said, I'm going to actually pass the microphone to you. Feel free to share your screen if you need to. In case anybody has questions, my suggestion is to kind of save those questions for a time where James is okay to answer them. We ideally don't want to kind of interrupt in the middle of the presentation. With that said, let's get started. Thank you so much.
Cool. Thank you very much for the intro, Bijan. And as you said, let's jump right in. So I will share my screen here, and then we can get started chatting about responsible AI. Are folks able to see the screen? Okay. Don't hear anyone, but I'm assuming silence means yes in this case.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, I was on mute. Yes.
Okay, perfect. Great. Let's get started then. So just I'll give a quick intro on myself first, although Bijan did a great job there. So a little background on me. So I've worked as a product manager at 3 big tech companies, Microsoft, Amazon, and Meta. At both Amazon and Meta, I focused on AI-centric products, recommendation systems, similarity systems, that sort of thing. And I've been doing that for about 4 years of AI-specific product management. Currently, I'm based in New York City, and I'm working with a few friends on a very, very early, let's call it AI-centric startup company. And so a lot of this responsible AI development has been very top of mind for me lately. So it's very timely that we're going to have this conversation. So what will we cover today? So first, I want to give a quick overview of definitions of responsible AI and why we should care about it, just to make sure all the viewers of this are on the same page before we start getting into the specifics of problems, frameworks, and regulation, all that good stuff. And then we'll end the talk with some final summarizing thoughts and additional anecdotes, and hopefully should have around 15 minutes at the very end for questions. So as Bijan said, if you have questions, if you don't mind just holding those till the end, we'll make sure to leave some time for that. What we will not cover, so while our subject material is going to be talking about AI, machine learning systems more broadly, we're not going to be discussing any actual AI system development today, nor are we going to really get into best practices for product managers generally, outside of those related to this topic of responsible AI. So I believe there's some previous recorded sessions actually from this series that cover these topics more in depth. Definitely encourage you guys to check them out, and I'm sure Bijan can point you to them if you haven't found them yet. So with all that out of the way, let's jump in. So what is responsible AI for our purposes? In the context of tech products, specifically AI-centric products, there are a few questions that we should ensure as product owners that we can answer about any products we have that have AI systems. Firstly, are the AI systems accurate, objective, and as fair as possible? And I want to emphasize the as possible piece here because AI systems will always have a level of bias, not for technological reasons per se, but rather AI systems tend to codify the different biases based on the skew of training data and often the innocently intended assumptions made by whatever architects are designing the systems. Secondly, do we collect, store, and train on data in a privacy-first and secure manner? Hopefully this one is relatively self-explanatory, but we'll dive a bit more into it in just a bit here. And lastly, are the decisions arrived at by our AI models transparent and auditable? So if we were asked as product owners, could we explain in layman's terms more or less how our AI product arrived at a particular decision? And put conversely, is our system opaque, unexplainable? If someone looked at it, would they be able to tell how we got at that decision? These are questions that we should be asking ourselves in the design portion of designing AI systems. So I want to double click on a few of these terms. So first, I want to double click on bias. So as Bijan said, there will be a session that goes more in depth on this later, but still relevant to the topic of responsible AI. So we're going to touch on it here. So when we think of a machine learning pipeline, we need to realize that there is more than just the model to consider here. AI systems are in reality a data pipeline spanning from collection to storage to training and at times disposal of the data. Each section of this pipeline on the screen has the potential for different kinds of risk. So for bias, here we define bias as a material and systemic difference between the actual or expected values of a situation and the predicted values produced by the model. So why does bias happen? So bias might occur in the training data. There could be over or underrepresentation of a particular class of data. It could happen due to the choice in model. So for example, if we chose something like a linear regression model that is attempting to predict a inherently nonlinear relationship, that might cause a level of bias. Uh, Underfitting to the training data such that the model struggles to find meaningful patterns based upon the trained data might lead to a level of bias. And additionally, overfitting as well to the training data such that the model is not able to generalize well to unseen data. These are all places where bias might occur in this pipeline. Secondly, clicking on privacy. When it comes to privacy, actually every stage of this pipeline has the potential for user privacy violations, each of which can and should be mitigated with a privacy-first best practice. So some examples of privacy risks might include, are we collecting more data than we actually need? And therefore kind of creating inherent risk with the data that we're taking into our system. Is the data that we're collecting tied to personally identifiable information, which introduces a level of both legal and ethical risk to the system? Are we using personally identifiable information for training? And if so, how are we using that data? And is that PII, personally identifiable information, PII, is that PII visible to employees, and especially employees that maybe don't need access to that data? And then even if we move away from user data for a moment, are we revealing inadvertently proprietary or sensitive data that maybe the system shouldn't have access to, even if it's not related to users, maybe it's related to something more like our business, something sensitive there. These are things we need to think about when thinking about privacy. And we'll touch a little more in depth on that in just a moment. And last, but certainly not least, I want to double click on the term transparency. So while there are technical limitations on what we can explain about a model, notably, especially in neural net-based architectures, which are kind of known for not being very explainable, we should be able to understand to a degree as product owners what factors or inputs is a model evaluating while making a decision. How are we weighting those different factors? What's important to the model and to our business, and what do we consider to be less important? And why does the model weight certain things the way it does? Is it because of business rationale, logic that we've introduced as owners? Is it because of something in the way we've trained the model? It's now weighting certain factors a certain way. Being able to, at least at a high level, understand and explain that to relevant stakeholders, to users, possibly to regulators, if it comes to that, becomes very important, especially when we start utilizing these models when we start utilizing these models to make decisions around life-changing situations such as medicine, housing loan applications, anything that might have a very material impact on the users for which it's predicting. And we will also discuss this in a bit more depth in just a moment. So now we've talked about some definitions here. I think it's important to explicitly talk about why we should care as PMs and business owners about developing and deploying AI systems responsibly. Beyond it just being the right thing to do, there are actually some very real business justifications to consider responsible AI development from the very get-go. So some very real reasons why you should be thinking about this right from the beginning. First, let's discuss the size and power of the market over our society. So I found some of these numbers in a few journals online. that estimate that the global AI market size is worth approximately $207.9 billion US dollars in 2023, and is projected to reach about $594 billion by 2032. So for the mathematicians here, that's a compound annual growth rate of about 19% from 2023 to 2032. So, a lot of money there, a lot of space, only going to keep growing. As an additional anecdote for the size of the AI market today and kind of its impact on society, right now, according to a representative phone survey from around the US, approximately 40% of people in the US utilize different AI systems, for example, voice search functions, Siri, that sort of thing, at least once every single day. And so as the number of users who rely on AI systems grow, and as the businesses surrounding these systems also continue to grow, we need to ensure that the systems we're building are built responsibly such that we do not inadvertently cause user and business problems down the road. Now, speaking of business problems, there's a multitude of business risks that can come with kind of developing an ML system, not thinking about responsible AI and just letting it loose in the wild. I'm sure we've all seen different things in the news. I put a few examples here. In the best case, these stories that come out, these issues can be embarrassing for a company. But in the worst case, these issues might actually cause real harmful impact to real users. So I have different examples for kind of these three sub areas I defined earlier. So as an example of issues with accuracy, Google, kind of like Bijan said at the very beginning, has run into multiple recent issues. One of which was that Google's Gemini chatbot competitor to OpenAI's ChatGPT very publicly was put to generate images of historical scenes that had very blatant historical inaccuracies in there. Its prior iteration, called Bard, had so many hallucinations. Famously, it said that falsely said that the James Webb Space Telescope captured the world's first image of a planet outside of our solar system, that mistake alone was attributed to a $100 billion market value loss, or about 9% of Alphabet's overall value. So very meaningful there. In the realm of kind of objectivity, subjectivity, Amazon a few years ago landed in hot water when the press discovered that some of its recruitment teams have been using an AI resume screening tool that favored male applicants to technical roles over non-male applicants for those same roles. So real user harm coming for job applicants there, obviously not good. And in the realm of privacy, there are realistically too many issues that keep popping up to count. I listed an example here of employees feeding a model proprietary data that they weren't authorized to do so. But these issues extend all the way to fundamental user trust. So I'm sure we've all heard the conspiracy that our phones or our favorite social media apps are listening to us and giving us targeted ads based on our conversations. That's a real, very fundamental user trust issue that can very much harm brands and products. So I have a data point here that's a bit older, but according to another phone survey conducted in May 2019, approximately 43% of Americans who own a smartphone believe that their phone is recording conversations without their permission. Obviously not true in reality, but we can imagine that user perception number will probably grow over time. And actually, just this past week, so I kind of added this slide in recently, you would think that we've learned from some of these mistakes, but unfortunately, it seems kind of as an industry, we keep repeating them. So earlier this week, Bloomberg tasked OpenAI's GPT 3.5 with the task to rank resumes for specific jobs. And they found that at a statistically significant level, the GPT 3.5 favored names from certain demographics over other demographics, agnostic of education, background, actual qualifications for the job. So this is reminiscent of the Amazon issue from a few years ago that I discussed, and demonstrates that we have a long way to go when it comes to recognizing these patterns and pushing forward responsible AI development. So what does this mean for us as product professionals? Well, in conjunction with our cross-functional partners, it means that it's imperative for us to include goals and metrics related to responsible AI as part of our AI system design requirements. and that this should happen as early as possible in the AI system development, ideally when we're coming up with that initial spec to actually design the AI system. So right from the get-go, we should be thinking about this stuff. Okay, so what can we do? Let's jump into some examples of frameworks that hopefully you can use in your day-to-day work as PMs to help identify, excuse me, and evaluate some of the risks in bias, privacy, and transparency, and go from there. So first, let's talk about bias. So when thinking about proactively addressing potential bias in an AI model, one useful tool is disparate impact theory. I put a full quote from the MIT Law Magazine on this theory here because I think they stated it in the most accurate and complete way that I've seen so far. So just to read the first part here, disparate impact theory focuses on unintentional discrimination caused by seemingly neutral policies or practices. It recognizes that such practices can disproportionately affect individuals from protected classes, but also really any class within a set of data, even without explicit discriminatory intent. The theory acknowledges that unintentional biases or systemic disparities can lead to discrimination in employment, housing, lending, education, and other important areas, and analyzing statistical disparities and considering their impact on protected classes helps identify and address systemic biases. So put in layman's terms, what that all means is that disparate impact theory is about acknowledging that bias towards or against specific groups can occur in AI systems, even with the best of intentions, and encourages employing objective mathematical methods to address these biases. So what does that mean in practice? So putting this theory to concrete steps, if we follow this framework, we first will want to define what classes protected by law or otherwise that we want to consider in our analysis. So some canonical examples might be race, gender, age, that sort of thing. From there, we analyze the AI system decision-making steps that need evaluation. So where are decisions happening? What data is it taking in? From data collection all the way to the final decision phase. We then gather representative data, define baseline measures of what is an acceptable baseline for the particular metric that we're interested in, and assess whether there's any statistically significant difference in any of the observed disparities between groups, between classes there from these baselines. If there is a statistically significant disparity, we should then identify what are the contributing discriminatory factors. So for example, kind of like we discussed earlier, is our input data not representative of the overall population that we're trying to make predictions for? And once we've identified those discriminatory factors, we should take proactive steps, try to mitigate those biases and promote fairness in the AI system. So in the example where our data is not representative, can we make it more representative somehow by either generating additional data, collecting additional data, using some statistical techniques to maybe add some weight to data that's underrepresented? Lots of different options there. The goal of this process is to improve transparency and understandability of the AI system's decision-making process. And it's important to note that this should be a repeating process. We should continuously assess the AI system's performance, address emerging biases, and maintain fairness over time. So that's the theory, and kind of some concrete steps that you can do to try to put it into practice. Another concrete step here to put it into practice is to proactively develop what we call a bias impact statement for the model. So answering these 5 questions will go a long way in helping you proactively address potential bias in your model. So questions such as, what does the model do? And what we mean by what here is who is the audience of the algorithm, who will be most affected by it. That will help you identify those different classes by which you can determine if there's differences. How are we going to be detecting bias here? So how and when will the model be tested and who will be the targets for the testing? A little bit of self-reflection. What are our incentives? So what do we as a company, as a business owner, gain in the development of this model? And how might these incentives run contrary to the goal of having an unbiased model? So making sure that ultimately our own incentives are aligned with the goal of responsible AI development through the disparate impact theory. How are we engaging stakeholders, if at all? So what is the feedback loop that we are getting from both internal and external partners on this, as well as customers? Ideally, we want a very clear and easy way for the users that are being impacted by our model to give feedback directly to us as to whether there is some level of bias for a particular class that we can then incorporate and try to improve the model from there. And lastly, has diversity been considered? And when we say diversity here, we mean for whatever data we're considering, whether that's about people, whether that's about cars, pets, whatever may have you, whatever those different classes are there, are we considering the different perspectives from those different classes, different cultural groups, and making sure that the impact that we're delivering for our model considers these perspectives, making sure we're kind of having a more holistic view of the people, cars, pets, houses, whatever it may be, that we're actually ultimately impacting at the end of the day. So, talked about bias for a little bit. I also want to touch on a framework to address privacy concerns. So, on the privacy side of things, I can certainly speak to real world solutions that I've personally used at companies that I've worked at. Despite perhaps popular opinion, in my experience, many big tech companies actually do have pretty stringent data use policies of varying degrees of strictness, particularly in working with machine learning models. I and some of the teams I supported at the last few companies I worked at had to go through very strict privacy reviews before launching any material changes to our machine learning pipelines. And again, the pipeline spanning all the way from data collection through training, inference, analytics, that sort of thing. And I definitely recommend that other companies who maybe have not yet implemented that sort of process go ahead and do so. So the crux of these privacy reviews is to try to answer these three questions. If the answer to any of them is yes, then we need to ask ourselves whether a reasonable observer would find our use acceptable from an ethical standpoint. So does this use new user data? Does this use existing user data in a new way? And lastly, are we changing how we're storing the data or our retention policy? Ideally, there should never be any infinite retention policy in company policies. There should always be a window in which we're deleting user data, particularly PII, that is both within the confines of law and also that a reasonable observer would find acceptable. So something 30 days, 60 days, depending on the specific data, that context is relevant. So what are some best practices that we can put into play here? So firstly, you want to make sure that your system is only collecting the data necessary. You never want to have a system that collects all the user data and stores it just because we might need it later. That is absolutely not what you want to be doing. You need to make sure that every piece of data that you're ingesting into your systems is absolutely necessary for the task at hand and has a very real business justification. Secondly, there are many techniques you can use to anonymize the data. So sometimes the data that you need for your model, you don't actually need to have to tie it to a specific user. It's become increasingly common. I've seen at some big tech companies, notably Apple, has been very transparent with their privacy frameworks, and they talk about how now with a lot of the data they collect, they assign random IDs to the rows such that the data cannot be tied back to any specific user. And that can help them. That both is good for the users, but also helps companies like Apple, for example, protect themselves in case of data breaches. As a quick aside, I think I read that in addition to assigning the random IDs, those IDs actually get changed over time. So even if there was a leak, after a certain period of time, all the IDs will be randomly reassigned again. So it really becomes difficult to tie it back to a specific user. And another way to anonymize the data that I didn't write out here is you can simply just group the data. And so instead of looking at any particular individual data row, you could just say, okay, well, let's get some data for the average of all of our users, the thousands of users that are in this age range in this country. And that can be a way to get useful data that you can then give to your model without necessarily allowing it to be tied back to a specific individual. Thirdly, we want to make sure we have very strict data access rules. So ensuring that this hopefully anonymized data that we have now is accessible only to those who absolutely need it for a specific work-related purpose. So we don't want to run into the case where we just have some SQL table or other type of database that is accessible to everybody in the company. There's been numerous examples in the news, notably Meta a few years ago with the whistleblower that happened, who was able to find all this data and information that probably should not have had access to in the first place. You need to make sure that your company has these very strict data access policies, and that the policies also expire after a amount of time. So if I'm able to access some user data for a very specific work-related purpose, I've been approved for that. I probably don't need it forever. Probably my access should be revoked after a certain amount of time, maybe 30 days. And then if I need it again after that 30 days, I should go through the same process of getting approved to access the data, justifying it again with a real business reason. And lastly, this is kind of one that, at least for me, is a bit newer, but what I've seen is that a lot of these machine learning models, companies are pushing to training on local devices. And what that allows you to do is, for example, like I say, I probably shouldn't use a real example, but you can imagine if there's an app that makes use of a machine learning model that may or may not require the use of personally identifiable information in order for it to make its inferences. If it does its training on the local device, so perhaps on an individual user's iPhone, then that PII never leaves the user. It never gets stored anywhere server side in the company. No employee can look at that PII. And it's just another technique that you can use to ensure that this data, which carries an inherent amount of legal and business risk, as well as ethical considerations, never actually leaves the user in the first place. So particularly with advancements of machine learning models getting smaller, that's becoming more possible, and definitely, in my opinion, a relatively straightforward way to kind of responsibly deploy some of these models to users. And lastly, we talked a bit about transparency earlier. So I want to give maybe not as much a framework, but more of a few thoughts on that. I have to admit that addressing transparency and explainability can be difficult depending on the architecture of the model that you're using, in particular with neural net-based architectures, which are very popular right now. They're kind of known for being that black box. It's difficult to understand what's happening inside of them. The best practice is, to the best of your ability, instituting a culture of documenting, both documenting what inputs are given to a model, what features are derived from those inputs, and where possible, what decisions the model is making in real time. That leaves a paper trail that can be called upon should an executive or some sort of outside body ask you how a particular decision was made. You can then point to it and say, okay, well, we gathered these inputs, we weighted them accordingly here. And because of the weights of these inputs and the data that was passed in, here's how we arrived at that decision. Again, easier with some architectures like tree-based models where it's a little more explainable, but even with neural nets, there's now technology that can allow you to create this paper trail that you can then use for audit later. So many machine learning libraries such as scikit-learn now have that built-in functionality that can allow you to do this automatically and at scale. AWS actually has a very comprehensive set of documentation on how to do this if you're using the AWS suite. I linked the paper with that at the very end of the slide deck that you can find. Secondly, you just, outside of the documentation piece, you want to continue to engage with the users that you are impacting with this model to ensure that they have an understanding of what factors are used and whether they're comfortable with it. So again, you have to kind of evaluate this on a case-by-case basis based on what your business is, who your users are, what are the legal requirements versus what do you want to do just kind of because it's the right thing to do. But I think building a little bit of user trust can go a very long way, especially when it comes to users feeling comfortable with your products. So as we talked about earlier, there's kind of a very wide-ranging conspiracy theory about Users are afraid that their phones and their social networks are listening to them. Perhaps if some of these companies that developed these technologies were a little more transparent in how they were arriving at some of the recommendations for ads and that sort of thing to users, then maybe users could look at that and say, oh, okay, I understand that my phone is not listening to me. And in fact, that it's X, Y, and Z that I'm doing that it's taking into consideration when it makes ad recommendations. And for that reason, I'm getting very relevant ads that almost seem like my phone is listening to me. That level of transparency, again, can really help you build that trust, which in turn has positive business externalities that you could have there as well. And then conversely, also hopefully preventing some PR and legal issues down the road that can arise from people not understanding your model. So now that we've talked about a few frameworks to tackle bias, privacy issues, and transparency issues, let's talk about some challenges that can come with the development of responsible AI. So on the implementation side of things, I would be remiss if I did not upfront discuss the inherent tension that can sometimes come between personalization and better user experiences from models with data privacy and addressing potential bias. There are two facets, to this. Firstly, data and product professionals if you're designing responsibly, you're forced almost to be more creative in how you're designing a privacy-first responsible AI system. So in the past, not pointing fingers at any particular companies, but it might have been considered more acceptable just to vacuum up all the data and all the telemetry and feed it into the model, and whatever happens, happens. If we're thinking about a privacy-first responsible AI system design, at the very beginning, we have to realize we can't do that anymore. And so we have to be a lot more intentional about the data that we're taking in, how we're using that data, what is the retention policy, who is it impacting, how is it impacting them, and all that leads to just typically a little bit more complex system design, where now with these extra requirements, you have to do a little bit extra more there. So that kind of leads to some extra hoops that you have to jump through, which can sometimes slow down innovation a little bit. And secondly, the actual speed of development might slow down just sheerly because of extra process that you're adding in. So at companies that I've worked at the past, privacy reviews in particular were notorious for being the long pole in shipping new features and updates, where maybe like we had everything done, but the privacy review team was backed up, and so we had to wait another couple weeks or a month in order to actually launch the thing that we wanted to launch, in order to ensure that we were getting the right approvals and considering the right things, from a privacy standpoint before shipping. And this can get particularly onerous towards the end of the development cycle, where if your company, for example, operates on halves, your team probably towards the end of each half is getting pretty stressed about shipping the things that they've been working on, delivering the projects, delivering the impact that they've been working on time before the end of the half. And if they leave that privacy review phase to the last minute, that can potentially mean delays in shipping. So it's just something that you have to think about as a product owner in terms of the sequencing of how you're doing things, of making sure you're getting that privacy review process set up and then conducting it in a timely manner such that it doesn't delay any sort of shipping that happens for your company. Another challenge can be around implementing policies for your company to address responsible AI development. In general, we see that you can have two, and this isn't a hard and fast rule, this is just more something I've observed, that you can generally have kind of 2 out of 3 when designing policies. So the 3 things are, firstly, clear rules, second, integrity of those rules, and then third, enough latitude for innovation. It is very difficult to design policies that give you all 3. And each subset of the 2 have their own problems. So, for example, very clear rules around privacy and the handling of data, transparency around data that have integrity and are very strict, they might stifle and slow down innovation. So kind of like I described earlier, where privacy reviews were the long pole and delayed things, that can really slow down the pace of process that you're making in your company. While as high integrity rules with enough latitude for innovation, they're probably pretty vague, where you kind of generally say, okay, do or don't do these things, but you haven't spelled out to the letter what needs to happen. That gives you a little bit of room to operate in that can help keep innovation moving, but could potentially run into issues later if there's any sort of audit or you need to figure out why something happened. So there's pros and cons to emphasizing each subset of two of those three there. And I think properly getting these processes down and figuring out what emphasis you want to put on which two of these three is an important consideration for product owners when you're considering responsible AI development. So beyond the implementation challenges, let's talk about the legal component here. So speaking of policy, it is important to discuss the specific legal frameworks that exist today to govern data use. So these legal frameworks were actually the impetus of a lot of the discussion that led to the development of kind of the responsible AI movement and to this talk here today. So both the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR for short, and the California Consumer Privacy Act, CCPA for short, are crucial pieces of legislation aimed, excuse me, at enhancing data privacy and transparency for constituents. So GDPR is for EU citizens, and CCPA, technically for California, but functionally operates across most of the US. And so I kind of spelled it out on the slide here. GDPR, in brief, is a set of EU regulations that gives EU citizens a set of rights when it comes to the collection and use of their personal data. This requires companies to obtain clear and informed consent to disclose data breaches and to permanently delete data when requested to by that user. The CCPA, as I said, while there's not US-wide legislation officially enacted yet, California has kind of enacted a similar set of regulations to the GDPR that a lot of companies in practice just use for all US users. Functionally, the CCPA focuses on the right to opt out of data sales and a user's right to access data collected on them. So if you've ever been on an app or website and have seen that "do not sell my personal information" link, that's because of the CCPA. And actually, what's kind of cool is just this week, the EU Parliament approved a brand new set of regulatory ground rules. They'll be the first ones to govern AI. So it's expected to become law and implemented in 2025. So I'm sure there'll be some changes that happen. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on the specifics of this act just because it probably will change before it's enacted. But right now, it focuses on, excuse me, categorizing the risk levels of different types of AI development and the regulation of these different categories. So kind of giving almost a set of buckets of, okay, well, are you doing predicting what kind of medicine a user should have? That's probably in one of the higher risk categories versus something like, here I've recommended a music playlist for you. That's probably going to be in a lower risk category. And the laws and kind of penalties associated with each of those buckets are going to be different, is my understanding. I'm not a lawyer, but just wanted to put that out there to get it on folks' radar. So now that we've discussed the space, the problems, some potential solutions and frameworks, some challenges, some regulations, we can kind of summarize it all up now, and I'll leave you guys with some final thoughts. So recapping, so what we talked about here, I created this table to compare what I would consider to be more of typical software development, things I've seen kind of firsthand in the non-AI, non-responsible AI world, to highlight key changes that should be made to your processes in order to make a more responsible AI-first approach. So first, moving from, excuse me, not considering bias basically in this first row is kind of what we sometimes see in the software development world, where you get a set of teams that are working on some system. They aren't necessarily considering all the different groups that they might be impacting. They kind of ship the thing and see what happens. Shifting to a more proactive approach, where proactively we define classes and metrics to audit for bias, regularly auditing for statistically significant disparities between these classes is one of the shifts that needs to happen. Secondly, in the realm of privacy, a lot of companies today kind of look, maybe not the bare minimum, that might be a harsh way to put it, but they're mostly looking at what's required of us by law to do. Let's just follow the law and kind of leave it there. We want to shift to a more comprehensive set of best practices for data privacy and protection that go beyond what the law actually dictates to make sure that we are proactively getting ahead of any issues that might happen that could be embarrassing for the company or cause user harm, and possibly most important, build more user trust. And then lastly, looking at the transparency side of things, a lot of companies today, not because they're malicious or anything like that, but just not really thinking about how users are perceiving their systems. There tends to be minimal transparency for machine learning based decisions. They're developed by internal teams who understand how the system works. They get shipped, there's a UI slapped on it, the users start using it, and the users don't get how we got from some set of inputs to a set of outputs. I think the shift that needs to happen there is a more comprehensive set of documentation for the different machine learning pipeline stages, developed in conjunction, ideally, with subject matter experts, depending on what you're working on, and community members. So, for example, if you were working on a tool for housing loans, maybe consulting with experts in that space, as well as talking to different users who are using the tool, who might be impacted by the decisions made there, can be a good way to both uncover issues as well as develop better transparency and user trust there. If there's one thing, I want folks to take away from this talk, I would say that it is to acknowledge that all machine learning models will exhibit some level of inaccuracy or bias based on training data, developer assumptions, model selection, and training methods. And the best that we can really do is to bake responsible AI frameworks into our design and development processes such that we can mitigate the very real user, business, and legal risk posed by AI systems. Transparency, explainability, and proactive partnership with both experts and the user communities impacted by the systems are critical to mitigating risk and establishing user trust. Lastly, since I'm sure there's some entrepreneurs in this audience, thought it'd be kind of fun. I threw together a few high-level startup ideas that I've not really gone into depth on, but just thoughts I had of potential areas folks can get into if they're interested. First is a platform to automatically check compliance with some of these regulatory frameworks like GDPR and CCPA. There are some existing tools out there right now, but as far as I'm personally aware, I don't think any have gained significant amounts of traction. If I'm wrong, please do correct me, but that might be a space that potentially someone could go in and disrupt. The second is improved methods to detect hallucinations from the various LLMs. Obviously, kind of tricky to accomplish, but I think having some sort of third-party tool that could look at different LLM-based models, understand when a hallucination might be happening, and identify that could be very useful. Of course, if you're able to detect it, you might as well go ahead and fix it, but there might be something there for folks to look into. And lastly, but certainly not least, is mitigating the environmental impact of AI. So this is an area that I didn't think I would really have enough time to talk about in this talk, so I kind of didn't include it, but monitoring and mitigating the environmental impact of AI certainly falls under the umbrella of responsible AI development, in my opinion, and certainly is an area worth exploring for disruption. Lastly, I have some reading for folks that are interested. So I have one book here that I actually was reading kind of leading up to this talk that I think is really great talking about this, Weapons of Mass Destruction, as well as several articles ranging from academic papers and some of the concepts that I listed, as well as some news articles about some of the incidents that we referenced earlier in the talk. So please feel free to dive into those if you're interested on learning more. And that's the talk. So again, want to thank Bijan and Product Management Exercises for bringing me here today to discuss this important topic. I've put my contact information on this slide. Please do feel free to reach out to me if you want to connect after the talk. In the meantime, would love to answer any questions that there are.
All right, thank you so much. Really great presentation, James. Really appreciate it. We got a few questions that are posted, so I'm going to go based on priority of the questions that were raised.
Okay.
So the first question that was posted was by Hardika, and the question was, so are these biases notified on the test data or only post-launch once we have enough user data? In case it's post-launch, how does one ensure minimal bias before launching these models to the public? So curious to know what your thoughts are in there.
Yeah, let me just repeat the question to make sure I got it. So the question is, at what stage should we start looking for bias? Are we looking more in pre-launch training, that sort of thing, or are we looking more in post-launch? And then secondarily, I think the question was, how do we go about mitigating the bias? Is that a fair way to put it?
Yeah, especially given that if you have minimal data at first, right?
Mhm.
How do you ensure that your bias is still very small?
Totally. No, that's a great question. I think as with uh, many of these questions when it comes to AI system development, it does need to happen on a case. These questions need to be answered on a case by case basis. I would say in general, as early as you can try to do some of these disparate impact analyses as possible is best. So if you have what you think is representative data that you're training your model on, I think trying to conduct that analysis pre-launch is important and the best case there. Because even if you think your data is representative and good for the users that you're doing some sort of prediction on, you might catch some sort of statistically significant difference between groups before launching. And I think the important thing there and kind of the crux of this whole bias identification is you or your team as the product owners need to be able to identify to the best of your ability who are the different groups, who are the different classes we think might be impacted here. And by drawing those group lines, then you can kind of conduct that statistical analysis to see if there's a significant difference between the groups. If for some reason you don't think you have enough sufficient data pre-launch, or maybe your team doesn't have great insight into what the different groups or classes might be, there's maybe different ways you could try to mitigate that. For identifying different classes and groups, of course, talking to users, talking to subject matter experts might be a way to uncover that information. And if you don't have sufficient data, that's a difficult one to address certainly, but I think you could look at through your launch plan trying to mitigate that, where maybe if you have a phased launch, some sort of alpha or beta launch, or maybe only rolling out to 1% of users for a week or so you can collect that initial data and do that analysis, might be a good way to mitigate that bias without necessarily just kind of shipping it over the wall to all the users and hoping for the best. So I think it comes down to just trying to, as early as possible, identify the bias and then mitigate it with as minimal impact to users as possible is how I would summarize that.
Got it. Thanks so much for sharing that. And then one more question. I think this is kind of maybe related, or feel free to say it's already been discussed. Like Christine is asking, how do we establish the baselines? Yeah, I guess it's kind of a little bit relevant to what you already shared, but feel free to kind of dig more into it.
Yeah, totally. Again, we'll start with the caveat that it will depend specifically on the context of the use case that you're building for. But when I think about establishing a baseline, the steps are kind of okay in the set of users or whomever we're building for. Again, let's try to identify to the best of our ability the different classes, different groups, and how do we see if what groups there might be differences in impact across. Excuse me. And then once you have those different groups, just seeing what seems to be a typical output or an expected output for the model. So the baseline, if it was something like a regression model, okay, across the different groups let's say we have 5 groups, are 4 of them kind of getting roughly the same relationship that's expected here, and 1 isn't? Well, probably those 4 are following your baseline, while as that 1 that's kind of way off, there probably is a statistically significant difference between them. So in my mind, I'm sure there probably are some more technical ways to go about doing this, but in my mind, there's a little bit of art with the science where you kind of have to look across the different groups, see what seems to be typical, normal, and call that your baseline. And then from that baseline, see, well, okay, are there any groups here that are big outliers or statistically significantly different? And that's how I would go about doing that.
Got it. Thanks so much for our context. So now next one, we're gonna go live, and I'm gonna ask Chitali to share her question. Chitali, please keep it to 1 question and in the topic of responsible AI, and then after you, we'll continue on the chats. Go ahead, Chitali. You're muted, so feel free to unmute yourself and ask 1 question.
Oh, thanks, Bijan. Hi, James. It's a very interesting session. So the question is, in the model development process, right, from data ingestion to inference, where and all the responsible practices should be put, and then also, are there any frameworks currently you are following to do that? Or any tools?
Yeah, let me go back to the slide where we show that, just so we have that visual there. So this is, this high level visual of the ML pipeline that I created. I'm sure if you want to get more granular, there's more steps you could add here, but at a high level, I think each of these phases has both risks, some of which we talked about earlier in the talk, and each of those risks has mitigation potentially. So, for me, and again, so your question was around, kind of where do we see the risks and how might we go about mitigating them? Is that fair to say?
Yeah.
Yeah. So
the risks, if we are assessing at the beginning of the project, right, and then try to find out the mitigating strategies.
Yeah, definitely. I think, agnostic of which project it is specifically, there's a set of things you can look at each of these stages, some of which we touched a bit on the talk. So for example, with data collection, a risk that's going to be inherent, no matter what your project is the data that you're collecting representative of the overall population that you're trying to make a prediction for, whatever the task is for your machine learning system. So that's one risk there that, of course, the mitigation can be, okay, well, let's, take a sample of what our typical user base is or whatever. Again, it depends on the context of the problem, and make sure that the data we're collecting matches that sample. Similarly, in the model training phase, model selection is something that's important, agnostic of what project you're doing. And as you're designing the project, being able to understand, well, okay, is this going to be a linear relationship? Is this going to be a non-linear relationship? Is this going to be, would a tree be the most appropriate model? Is a neural net the most appropriate model? The model selection component is very important here as well, and can lead to issues with bias where, kind of like I said earlier, if you have a linear model attempting to predict for a non-linear relationship, you're not going to get accurate results that come out of it. So that's, another area I would highlight here. And then when it comes to kind of the inference analysis presentation, I think agnostic of what project you're doing, it's just trying to get early and often feedback from the folks who are impacted by your project to make sure that everything is behaving as expected. So if your model is outputting a bunch of predictions, maybe first check yourself, is it matching what you expect? If it is, is it matching what the users expect? Maybe there's a difference between what the users are thinking and what you're thinking. And what are those gaps? Why are they there? And how can we go about addressing them? Just building that feedback loop is very important to start that whole process. And there's probably many more that we can get into here, but does that address your question?
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. We'd love to continue, but unfortunately, because we have a limited time, I kind of want to wrap it up. But first of all, thank you so much, James, for coming in. For those of you who are interested, the recordings will be available both on our newsletter in our community channel that we have also at the cohort in our dashboard. But before we wrap this up, I want to quickly invite maybe somebody from our current cohort, Subut. We'd love to hear your experience. Maybe you can kind of tell others that are currently considering joining our cohort. What has your experience been so far? I would love to just like kind of have you share maybe a minute about your experience.
Yeah, so I was wondering what I was getting into, and let me tell you, I'm utterly delighted. On week 3, and we've already written a PRD. So that's the first big win. Like, it's not just vaporware, just a bunch of fluffy lectures. No, I'm actually doing hands-on work, and it's allowed me to think about at least 2 or 3 different product ideas that, well, maybe these could be startups, like something like that. So it's like, wow, that's pretty awesome. I love the care. The teacher's great. And most of all, what I hear from them is the care. They're not dialing it in. They seem to really care. You can feel that always makes a difference. That these folks really want us to learn and know this field well and succeed in it. So I'm hearty 2 thumbs up for this. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to hear that. This is very important for us that people who go through the cohort have great experiences. And yes, one of the things that we do is we actually help everybody to write a PRD for an AI first product under our supervision. Hopefully that kind of simulates the real world experience of actually writing a PRD for a new product that you're building. So thanks so much. And for those of you interested, like we said, we've started taking applications for the next cohort. So if you're interested, please consider applying, and we're very excited about what's to come. So I'm going to just quickly share the link in our Zoom, and I think people on LinkedIn, they have the link. So thank you so much again for everybody who dialed in. I can see a lot of people came in to both Zoom and LinkedIn. And thank you so much again, James, for being here. Looking forward to seeing you all next week in the topic of bias in AI. And until then, have a great